Some people spend their whole lives believing they're not worth loving. 52-year-old Hazel Winters is one of them, running her small bakery alone in the Wyoming mountains, convinced that her worth ends with her sourdough bread. Then mountain man Cyrus Blackwood starts trading pelts for her baked goods. What begins as simple business becomes something more when two lonely souls find warmth together during the harsh winter months. Through quiet conversations and shared meals, Hazel discovers that love sometimes arrives not with grand gestures, but with patient understanding. When she finally whispers her deepest fear, Cyrus responds with words that change everything. Can a woman who has never felt beautiful learn to see herself through the eyes of a man who already loves her completely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden mixing spoon felt warm in Hazel's palm as she worked the sourdough starter, her mother's voice echoing in the quiet cabin like it did every morning. A woman's worth isn't measured by what others see, Hazel girl, but by the love she puts into her work. 3 years had passed since tuberculosis took Mama, yet the words still wrapped around Hazel like the patchwork quilt draped across her shoulders. A quilt sewn from fabric scraps, each piece holding a memory of better times. The cabin groaned against the early October wind, its log walls thick enough to keep out Wyoming's bite, but thin enough to let loneliness seep through the chinks. Hazel had been born in this one-room sanctuary, 20 miles from the nearest settlement, where her father had built their life with his own weathered hands before a mining accident claimed him when she was barely 16. Now, at 52, she moved through the familiar routine with practiced efficiency, her body soft and rounded from years of testing her own baking, her graying hair pinned back in a simple bun that hadn't changed style in decades. The sourdough bubbled contentedly in its ceramic crock, alive with the same cultures her grandmother had nurtured in Kansas before the family moved west. Hazel fed it daily, talked to it like an old friend, relied on its steady presence when everything else felt uncertain. Today she would bake 8 loaves, 2 dozen dinner rolls, and a batch of her famous cinnamon twists, enough to trade with the miners and trappers who made the trek up the mountain trail for her goods. She lit the wood stove with pine kindling, the flames casting dancing shadows across walls lined with her mother's preserves and dried herbs. The scent of yeast and rising dough mingled with wood smoke and the faint lavender sachets tucked behind the flour barrels. This cabin held her entire world, the kitchen where she worked her magic, the bed where she slept alone, the rocking chair where she mended clothes by lamplight, and the small table where she ate solitary meals while watching snow gather on the window ledges. Memory pulled her backward as she kneaded the dough, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered to that terrible spring, 16 years ago. She'd been 36 then, still believing that love might find its way to her mountain. Harold Pembroke had courted her for 3 months, riding up from town twice a week with wildflowers and promises. He'd been handsome in a soft, town-bred way, with smooth hands and clean fingernails, speaking of taking her away from this isolated life to live in his house near the church. "I know you're lonely up here, Hazel," he'd said, standing in this very kitchen. "A woman like you deserves better than baking bread for trappers and miners. A woman like you." The words had sounded kind at the time, gentle even. But on their wedding day, the dress already altered, the preacher waiting, the small gathering of townspeople assembled, Harold had pulled her aside behind the church. His face had been pale, his eyes unable to meet hers. "I can't do this, Hazel. I thought I could." But he gestured vaguely at her body, her face, her very existence. "People are talking. They're saying I'm marrying you out of pity, that no man would choose." He'd stopped himself, but the damage was already carved deep. "You're a good woman, a kind woman, but I need a wife I can be proud to stand beside." 16 years later, those words still stung like a fresh slap. The townspeople had whispered about poor, jilted Hazel for months afterward. Some said Harold had been cruel, others that he'd been honest. A few of the women had even approached her with sympathetic pats and offers of friendship that felt more like consolation prizes. But Hazel had learned to read the looks, the careful politeness that marked the difference between genuine kindness and social obligation. She shaped the dough into loaves with sure hands, placing them in the Dutch ovens that would soon fill her cabin with the aroma that had made her famous throughout the territory. Hazel Winters might not be much to look at, but even her harshest critics couldn't deny that she baked bread like an angel. It was the one thing she did that nobody questioned, the single aspect of herself she'd learned to take pride in without reservation. The morning passed in comfortable routine until she heard the familiar sound of horseshoes on stone. Through her small window, she watched Cyrus Blackwood emerge from the tree line, his pack-horse loaded with winter pelts. He came every Tuesday like clockwork, had been doing so for nearly 2 years, ever since word of her baking had reached his remote cabin higher up in the peaks. Cyrus was a man carved from the mountains themselves, tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by years of splitting wood and hauling water. His beard was more salt than pepper now, neatly trimmed around a weathered face that spoke of hard winters and quiet contemplation. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, never seeming to rush, even when storm clouds gathered overhead. What set him apart from her other customers was his manner. The miners joked roughly, the trappers shared crude stories, the occasional traveling families treated her with polite distance. But Cyrus spoke to her with the same respectful tone he might use with any woman, as if her appearance and circumstances didn't matter. He never stared at her body with the mixture of curiosity and disdain she'd grown accustomed to. He didn't offer false compliments or speak to her like she was a child or an invalid. He simply conducted his business, paid fairly, and went on his way. "Morning, Miss Winters," he said as she opened the door, removing his wool hat despite the cold. His voice carried the gentle roughness of a man who spent most of his time alone. "Morning." "Mr. Blackwood, right on time as always." She stepped back to let him enter, noting how he wiped his boots carefully before crossing her threshold. He set a bundle of rabbit pelts on her small table, the fur thick and lustrous from the cold mountain air. "Brought you these. Thought they might make a warm lining for a winter coat." "That's thoughtful of you." She wrapped 2 loaves of bread and a dozen rolls in clean cloth, adding a small crock of her blackberry preserves. "Though I do fine with the coat I have." "Yes, ma'am, I expect you do." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, and Hazel wondered if he was smiling beneath his beard. But a person can always use extra warmth when the real cold comes. She handed him the bundle, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were scarred from years of hard work, but surprisingly gentle, and she found herself wondering what they might feel like holding something fragile, something precious. "The snow's coming early this year," Cyrus observed, glancing toward the window where grey clouds gathered against the peaks. "You got enough firewood laid up?" "Plenty. Cut and split it myself this summer." She heard the defensive note in her voice and softened it. "But thank you for asking." He nodded, settling the bundle under his arm. Most customers would have left by now, but Cyrus seemed in no hurry. "That sourdough of yours is something special. Reminds me of bread my grandmother used to make back in Missouri." "Your grandmother was a baker?" "Among other things. Raised 8 children, mostly on her own, after my grandfather died in the war. Said bread was love you could hold in your hands." He paused, and Hazel caught something wistful in his expression. Never met a woman since who had that same gift. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Harold had never praised her baking, had barely noticed the effort she put into every meal she'd prepared for him. But here was a man who understood the care that went into each loaf, who tasted more than just flour and yeast. "I learned from my mother," she said, surprising herself with the admission. She always said the secret was in the patience. "Good bread can't be rushed. Wise woman." Cyrus moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. "Miss Winters, if you don't mind my saying, you ever think about getting one of those new kitchen ranges? Seen them in the catalog, might make your baking easier. Can't afford such luxuries." she replied honestly. Besides, this old stove and I understand each other. Something shifted in his expression, a look she couldn't quite interpret. Well then, I'll see you next Tuesday, assuming the weather holds. She watched him mount his horse with fluid ease, the rabbit pelts secured behind his saddle. He touched his hat brim in farewell and disappeared into the trees, leaving her alone with the lingering scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to him. Hazel closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating slightly faster than usual. She told herself it was nothing, just the normal reaction any woman might have to a kind, attractive man. But as she returned to her kitchen, she couldn't shake the memory of his gentle tone when he'd spoken of bread being love you could hold in your hands. The afternoon stretched ahead with its familiar rhythm of cooling loaves, tidying the cabin and preparing for another solitary evening. But something had shifted in the air, subtle as the change in seasons. Hazel pulled her mother's quilt closer around her shoulders and tried to convince herself that some things, like the weather, like loneliness, like the steady ache of wanting what you believed you could never have, were simply facts of mountain life, unchangeable as stone. Yet as she set the last loaves to cool and watched the first snowflakes begin to fall outside her window, she found herself wondering about Cyrus Blackwood's grandmother, about the love that could be held in your hands, and whether a woman like her might ever be worthy of such a gift. The storm came without warning on the following Thursday, 3 days ahead of Cyrus's usual visit. Hazel woke to the howling of wind that rattled her cabin walls and the distinctive silence that meant snow was falling thick and fast. By the time she'd stoked the fire and made her morning coffee, 6 inches had already accumulated on her windowsills, and the world beyond had disappeared into a wall of white. She went about her routine with practiced calm, mixing dough and feeding the fire while the storm raged outside. Mountain storms were nothing new. She'd weathered dozens alone, armed with enough firewood, food, and lamp oil to last a week if necessary. But as the morning wore on, the wind grew fiercer, and she began to worry about the weaker sections of her roof and the animals that might be caught in the open. The knock on her door came just before noon, barely audible above the storm's fury. Hazel wiped flour from her hands and peered through the small window, seeing only the vague outline of a man and horse through the driving snow. She opened the door to find Cyrus Blackwood, his coat white with accumulated snow, his horse's head hanging low against the wind. "Mr. Blackwood!" She stepped back to let him in, snow swirling around them both. "What are you doing out in this weather?" He stamped his boots and shook the snow from his coat before entering, his face red with cold. "Got caught between here and home when it hit. Mind if I wait it out? I can stay in your barn if you prefer." The suggestion that she might send him to her drafty barn in such weather struck her as absurd, yet she understood his careful politeness. A single woman didn't invite men into her home lightly, especially not for an indefinite stay. But one look at his ice-rimmed beard and the way his horse stood trembling in the yard decided her. "Don't be foolish. Get inside and warm yourself by the fire. I'll see to your horse. No need. There's every need." She was already reaching for her heavy coat. "I know where the extra blankets are kept." She led his horse to the small barn behind the cabin, her boots slipping in the deepening snow. The animal was a sturdy mountain breed, accustomed to harsh weather, but even he seemed grateful for the shelter. She rubbed him down with a rough cloth and gave him hay and water, talking softly to calm his storm nerves. When she returned to the cabin, she found Cyrus standing uncertainly near the door, as if unsure whether he should make himself comfortable or maintain formal distance. Snow melted in puddles around his boots, and she noticed he was shivering despite his efforts to hide it. "Sit by the fire," she commanded, hanging her coat on its peg. "You look half frozen. I don't want to impose, Mr. Blackwood." She faced him with her hands on her hips, using the same tone that had once made miners mind their manners in her presence. "This storm isn't letting up any time soon, and I won't have your death on my conscience because you were too polite to accept shelter." Something in her voice must have convinced him. because he finally moved toward the fire, extending his hands to the warmth. She bustled around the kitchen, putting water onto heat and slicing bread for what would now be a shared meal. "There's coffee if you'd like some," she offered, suddenly acutely aware that a man, this particular man, was in her private space, seeing how she lived when no one was watching. That would be welcome. "Thank you." She poured coffee into her second-best cup, the one she kept for the rare occasions when someone visited. Her hands shook slightly as she handed it to him, and she hoped he didn't notice. The cabin felt impossibly small, with his presence filling it, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his quiet breathing audible in the spaces between wind gusts. "This is a fine home," he said, looking around with genuine appreciation. "Warm and well-kept. It's small." The words came out more defensive than she'd intended. "Size isn't everything. It's clear you take pride in it." She busied herself with slicing cheese and arranging it on a plate with the bread. Pride, yes. She supposed she did take pride in her little cabin, in the way she'd maintained it since her parents' deaths, in the improvements she'd made with her own careful savings. It was perhaps the only other thing besides her baking that she allowed herself to feel good about. The storm lantern on her table cast a warm circle of light that seemed to make the space even more intimate. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, and she realized they might be trapped together for hours, possibly even overnight. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said suddenly, needing to fill the silence with something other than her growing awareness of his presence. Cyrus looked up from his coffee, and she caught the faint smile that creased his weathered features. Grandmother Blackwood was a force of nature, 5 feet tall and tough as boot leather. Had to be, raising that family on her own. "What happened to your grandfather?" "Died at Gettysburg. Left her with 8 children under 16, and a farm that was more debt than asset." He stared into the fire, his voice growing distant. "But she never once spoke of giving up. Used to say that God never gave anyone more than they could carry, and if the load felt too heavy, it just meant you hadn't found your full strength yet." Hazel found herself leaning forward, caught by the gentle reverence in his voice. "She sounds remarkable." She was. "Taught me everything I know about making a life in hard country." He glanced around the cabin again. "I think she'd have admired what you've built here." The compliment warmed her, but it also stirred up familiar doubts. "I haven't built much. Just gotten by." Getting by takes its own kind of courage. They fell into comfortable conversation as the afternoon wore on, sharing stories of harsh winters and summer plenty, of the challenges of mountain living and the peculiar satisfaction of self-sufficiency. Hazel found herself relaxing despite her initial nervousness, drawn by Cyrus's easy manner and genuine interest in her thoughts. When evening came and the storm showed no signs of abating, she offered him her parents' old bed in the small alcove while she took the chair by the fire. He protested naturally, but she insisted with a firmness that brooked no argument. "I've slept in this chair plenty of times," she lied, arranging blankets around herself. "It's perfectly comfortable." She listened to the sounds of him settling in, the creak of rope springs, the rustle of blankets, his quiet breathing gradually deepening into sleep. The storm continued its fury outside, but inside her cabin she felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't entirely alone with the howling wind and her own thoughts. When she finally dozed in her chair, wrapped in her mother's quilt, she dreamed of warm bread and gentle voices, of hands that held fragile things without breaking them, of a presence that made even the fiercest storm feel manageable. She woke before dawn to find the world transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind 2 feet of pristine snow that glittered in the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. Cyrus was already awake, quietly stoking the fire to spare her the cold morning routine. "Storms moved on," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "I should get moving while the weather holds." She prepared breakfast for both of them, eggs from her small flock of hens, thick slices of bacon, and fresh bread with honey. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the small sounds of shared domesticity. When he prepared to leave, Saddling his horse in the bright morning light, something had fundamentally shifted between them. They both felt it, a new awareness, a door that had opened during the long storm hours. "Thank you, Miss Winters," he said, settling into his saddle. "For the shelter, the food, the kindness." "You're welcome, Mr. Blackwood." She stood in her doorway, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "Safe travels." He touched his hat brim and rode away, but this time he looked back once before disappearing into the trees. Hazel stood watching long after he'd gone, the morning air sharp in her lungs and something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had before, echoing with the memory of his presence. As she cleared away the breakfast dishes and began her daily routine, she found herself moving more slowly, as if trying to hold on to the lingering traces of the night they'd shared, not in any improper way, but in the simple, profound intimacy of two souls finding shelter from the storm together. Tuesday came with unusual anticipation. Hazel found herself checking the window more often than necessary, listening for the sound of hooves on the frost-hardened ground. When Cyrus finally appeared through the trees, she felt her pulse quicken in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. He carried himself differently now. She noticed, less formally, as if the storm had washed away some invisible barrier between them. And tucked into his saddlebags alongside the usual pelts was a leather-bound journal, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. "Miss Winters," he greeted her, dismounting with his characteristic fluid grace. "I brought you something." From his coat pocket, he produced a small jar of wild honey, golden and thick, with bits of honeycomb still floating inside. "Found a tree full of it yesterday? Thought it might go well with your bread." She accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the simple thoughtfulness of it. "That's very kind of you." A wild honey as a treasure this late in the year seemed fitting for someone who creates her own treasures daily. He gestured toward the warm scent of fresh bread that always clung to her cabin like a welcoming embrace. As she wrapped his usual order, she found herself stealing glances at the journal he'd set on her table. The leather was dark with age and use, and she could see the faint impression of a pen pressed through multiple pages. "You keep a journal?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Cyrus glanced at the book and nodded. "Started it years ago. Helps me keep track of the seasons, the weather patterns, the way the mountain changes." He paused, then added more quietly, "Sometimes a man needs to put his thoughts somewhere outside his own head." She understood that instinct intimately. How many times had she found herself talking to the sourdough starter or addressing her mother's spirit when the silence grew too heavy? But she'd never had the courage to write her thoughts down, afraid of what they might reveal even to herself. "May I ask what you write about?" He seemed to consider the question carefully, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The practical things, mostly. When the first snow falls, which plants flower earliest, where the game trails run. But sometimes—" He touched the journal's edge with one weathered finger. "Sometimes I find myself writing about other things. Beauty, I've noticed. Thoughts that won't let me rest." The word beauty hung in the air between them, and Hazel felt heat rise in her cheeks. She turned to the stove, ostensibly checking on the bread, but really hiding her expression. What kind of beauty would a man like Cyrus write about? Mountain sunrises? The way light fell through pine branches? Surely nothing connected to her. "I used to write letters to my mother after she passed," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "Never sent them anywhere, of course. Just needed to tell her things." "What did you tell her?" The question was gentle, without prying, but it opened something in her chest like a door she'd kept locked for years. "About the loneliness, mostly. About wondering if I was living the life she'd wanted for me, or just the one I'd fallen into by accident." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally turned back to face him, his expression held an understanding that made her breath catch. "I think mothers want their children to find peace more than anything else. The shape that peace takes might surprise them, but the feeling itself, that's what matters. Have you found peace, Mr. Blackwood?" "I thought I had," he said slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "These past few years, living alone up in the peaks, I believed I'd settled into the life that suited me best. But lately, he stopped himself, seeming to choose his words carefully. Lately, I've begun to wonder if peace and contentment are the same thing. She knew exactly what he meant, though she'd never had words for it before. The difference between accepting your circumstances and truly being at peace with them. The difference between surviving and living. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of another rider, old Jake Morrison, one of the miners who occasionally made the trek up from the valley for her bread. His arrival reminded Hazel of the careful social boundaries she usually maintained, and she stepped back slightly, resuming her role as the mountain baker rather than the woman having an intimate conversation with a man who made her pulse race. But Cyrus didn't immediately return to formal distance. As Jake dismounted and approached the cabin, Cyrus gathered his journal and moved closer to Hazel, close enough that she could smell the pine and leather scent that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Miss Winters," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her. "I wonder if you might consider something." "What's that?" "I've been thinking about what you said, about talking to your mother. Sometimes the conversations we need to have with people who've passed are the same ones we need to have with people who are still here." Before she could ask what he meant, Jake Morrison was stomping up to her door, calling out his usual boisterous greeting. The moment of intimacy dissolved, but Cyrus's words echoed in her mind as she conducted business with Jake, measuring out flour and discussing the weather with practiced ease. After Jake left with his provisions, Cyrus lingered longer than usual. He helped her carry firewood from the pile behind the cabin, stacking it neatly by the door with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to such tasks. She found herself watching his hands as he worked, scarred and weathered but somehow graceful, handling each piece of wood with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "You don't need to do that," she protested, but without real conviction. "A person shouldn't do everything alone if they don't have to," he replied, continuing his work. "Besides, winter's coming hard this year. Better to have your wood close to the door." When the task was finished, he stood brushing bark fragments from his gloves and looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Miss Winters, Hazel, I hope you don't mind my saying, but you seem different somehow. Since the storm." "Different how?" "Less guarded, perhaps. As if something inside you had shifted." She felt exposed under his gentle scrutiny, as if he could see straight through the walls she'd built around her heart. "Perhaps being less alone for a night reminded me what conversation felt like." "Is that all it reminded you of?" The question hung between them, laden with possibilities that both excited and terrified her. She thought of the dreams that had visited her since that stormy night. Dreams of companionship and warmth, of hands that held fragile things without breaking them. "I should let you get on your way," she said finally, retreating to safer ground. "The afternoon's getting late," he nodded, understanding her need to step back but clearly disappointed. "Of course. Until next Tuesday, then." As he mounted his horse and prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at her. "Hazel, that conversation with your mother, the one you've been needing to have, maybe it's time." He rode away before she could ask what he meant, leaving her standing in her doorway with his words echoing in her mind and the scent of wild honey still clinging to her fingers. The carved wooden bird appeared the following Tuesday, nestled among the rabbit pelts like a secret waiting to be discovered. Hazel lifted it carefully from the bundle, marveling at the delicate detail work. Each feather precisely carved, the tiny beak slightly open as if caught in mid-song. It was a robin, she realized, the herald of spring and hope. "You made this?" she asked, turning the small sculpture over in her hands. Cyrus stood near her fire, having accepted her invitation to warm himself before the long ride home. "Whittling helps pass the evening hours. Thought you might appreciate having a bird that doesn't fly away when winter comes." The gift touched something deep inside her chest, a place that had been closed off for so long she'd forgotten it existed. No one had ever made something beautiful just for her before. Harold's courtship gifts had been practical: ribbons for her hair, a new mixing bowl, things meant to improve her appearance or usefulness. But this robin was pure artistry, created for no other reason than to bring her joy. "It's beautiful," she whispered, then louder, "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever been given." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or sadness at the idea that she'd received so few beautiful things in her life. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the way the firelight caught the amber flecks in his brown eyes. "May I?" He gestured toward her hand, and when she nodded, he gently adjusted her grip on the robin. "Feel here, along the wing." The grain of the wood runs in the same direction as real feathers would grow. His fingers brushed hers as he guided her touch, and Hazel felt a jolt of sensation that had nothing to do with the carved bird. His hands were warm and steady, calloused from years of hard work, but surprisingly gentle. She found herself wondering what those hands might feel like against her face, in her hair, and the thought made her breath catch. "You have an artist's soul," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never thought of myself that way. Just a man who's learned to see beauty in small things." The way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on her face as he spoke, made her wonder if he was talking about more than just wood carving. But surely that was wishful thinking. Men didn't see beauty when they looked at her. Hadn't Harold made that painfully clear? That afternoon, Cyrus stayed longer than ever before, helping her repair a loose shutter and checking the chinking between the logs for winter gaps. His presence filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and she found herself reluctant to see him leave. "The days are getting shorter," he observed, as shadows began to gather outside her windows. "They always do. This time of year makes a person appreciate the light while it lasts." He was looking at her again with that intense, thoughtful expression that made her feel like the most important thing in his world. When he prepared to go, she impulsively reached for the bread knife and cut him an extra loaf, wrapping it carefully in clean cloth. "For your long evenings," she said. "So you'll have something good to eat while you're whittling." Their fingers touched again as he accepted the gift, and this time neither of them pulled away immediately. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, and the growing awareness that something fundamental was shifting in their careful friendship. "Hazel," he said softly, and the sound of her name in his gentle voice made her heart race. "I want you to know, these visits, this time we spend together, it's become the best part of my week." Before she could respond, he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Her breath caught as his hand rose toward her face, and for one wild moment she thought he might touch her cheek, might bridge the careful distance they'd maintained. Instead, he reached past her to retrieve his hat from the table, the movement bringing him even closer before he stepped back. But she caught the way his eyes lingered on her lips, the slight tremor in his breathing that suggested he was as affected by their proximity as she was. "Until next Tuesday," he said, his voice rougher than usual. After he left, Hazel stood holding the wooden robin, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She'd seen desire in his eyes, she was sure of it. But desire was one thing and love was another. Harold had desired her too, in his way, enough to court her and make promises. But when the moment came to claim her publicly, when he had to choose between desire and pride, pride had won easily. She placed the robin on her kitchen table where she could see it while she worked, and tried to quiet the voice in her head that whispered warnings. Men like Cyrus Blackwood, handsome, capable, sought after by any woman with sense, didn't fall in love with women like her. They might feel kindness, even affection, but love, real love, the kind that lasted through harsh words and harder winters, that was asking too much. But as she prepared her evening meal and glanced repeatedly at the carefully carved bird, she couldn't help remembering the way his hands had felt against hers, the way he'd said her name like it was something precious. Maybe she was fooling herself, reading too much into simple gestures of friendship. Maybe she was setting herself up for the same heartbreak that had nearly destroyed her 16 years ago. Yet when she finally settled into her rocking chair with her mending, the robin perched nearby like a tiny guardian, she found herself imagining what it might be like to be truly seen by someone, truly wanted for who she was, rather than despite who she was. The fantasy was dangerous, she knew, but after years of emotional hibernation, the warmth of possibility felt too good to resist. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling her windows and reminding her that winter was coming, whether she was ready or not. But inside her cabin, surrounded by the lingering scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to everything Cyrus touched, Hazel allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this winter might be different from all the lonely ones that had come before. The wooden robin seemed to watch over her dreams that night, its carved eyes holding secrets about spring and second chances, about the kind of love that carved beautiful things just to see someone smile. The discovery came by accident. While reaching for flour from the high shelf, Hazel knocked over Cyrus's journal, which he'd left behind during his last visit. As she bent to retrieve it, the book fell open, revealing not just notes about weather patterns and hunting trails, but something that made her heart stop completely. There, hanging from a thin leather cord that had been tucked between the pages, was a woman's wedding ring, simple gold, worn smooth by years of wear. Hazel stared at it with growing understanding, her mind racing to connect the pieces she'd never quite assembled before. When Cyrus arrived that Tuesday, she was waiting for him in the doorway, the journal in her hands. His eyes immediately went to the open book, then to her face, and she saw a flicker of something, resignation perhaps, or relief that his secret was finally exposed. "You were married," she said without preamble. "I was." He dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "For 6 years. What happened to her?" He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "She died in childbirth. The baby too. 15 years ago come spring." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, she'd already guessed something of the sort, but because of the quiet pain that accompanied them. Here was the source of his solitude, the reason a man like him lived alone in the mountains instead of surrounded by family and community. "I'm sorry," she whispered, holding out the journal. "I didn't mean to pry. You weren't prying." "I should have told you before now." He accepted the book, but made no move to hide the ring again. Instead, he held it up to the light, studying it with the expression of a man examining an old wound. Her name was Margaret, Maggie. She was 23 when she died. Hazel felt a familiar stab of inadequacy. Of course, his wife had been young and beautiful, 23 to his likely 40 at the time. What woman wouldn't seem diminished in comparison to a beloved memory, especially one preserved in the amber of tragedy? She must have been very special, she managed. She was. He looked at Hazel then, and his expression was so gentle it almost broke her heart. "But Hazel, I need you to understand something. What I felt for Maggie, what we had together, that was a different life, a different man. The man I am now, the feelings I have now, they don't diminish what came before, but they don't depend on it either." She wanted to believe him, but 16 years of accumulated hurt made trust difficult. "People always say that love makes room for more love, but in my experience, there's usually only enough space for one person in a man's heart. Is that what you think? That I'm trying to replace her with you?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. They'd been dancing around their growing feelings for weeks, speaking in carefully coded language and meaningful glances. But here he was, laying it all bare with typical mountain practicality. "I don't know what you're trying to do," she admitted. "I only know that competing with a memory is a battle I could never win." Cyrus set down his journal and stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his weathered features. "You're not competing with anyone, Hazel. What I feel when I look at you, when I'm here in your home, when I think about you during the long evenings, it's not comparison or substitution. It's recognition of something I thought I'd never find again. Not the same thing, but something equally precious. The way you move through your kitchen, like it's a sacred space. The care you put into every loaf of bread. The quiet strength that lets you live alone on this mountain and never ask for help you don't need." He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. "The way my heart quickens when I see your cabin through the trees." His words wrapped around her like warmth, but doubt still gnawed at her confidence. "I'm not young like she was. I'm not beautiful?" He finished the sentence with a slight smile. "Hazel, do you want to know what I wrote in my journal last week?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He opened the leather book and flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. "I wrote watched H kneading bread today." The morning light through her kitchen window turned her hair to silver and gold. Her hands moved with such sureness, such grace. I've never seen anything more beautiful than the concentration on her face as she worked, like she was praying with her whole body. Heat flooded Hazel's cheeks. "You wrote that about me?" "I've written a dozen entries like it. About the way you laugh when you think no one's listening. About how your eyes light up when you talk about your mother. About the kindness you show to every rough man who comes to your door looking for bread and finds a moment of gentle humanity instead." She stared at him, struggling to reconcile his words with a lifetime of believing herself unworthy of such attention. "But I'm not, look at me. I am looking at you." His voice was soft but firm. "I've been looking at you for months, Hazel, really looking. And what I see is a woman who's spent so many years listening to other people's opinions that she's forgotten to trust her own eyes." Before she could protest again, he reached for her hands, enfolding them in his calloused palms. "Feel this," he said, guiding her hands to rest against his chest where his heart beat strong and steady. "This isn't pity or loneliness or settling for what's available. This is what happens when a man finds something he didn't know he was looking for. The warmth of his body beneath her palms, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the absolute certainty in his voice. It all combined to shake the foundation of every negative belief she'd built about herself. But change, even positive change, was terrifying. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I." He smiled then, the expression transforming his entire face. "But I'm more scared of letting fear rob us of something that could be wonderful." They stood there in her kitchen, hands joined, hearts beating in tentative harmony, while outside the window the first snow of winter began to fall. Hazel felt as if she stood at the edge of a great precipice, one that could either offer her the flight she'd always dreamed of or destroy her in the falling. "Cyrus," she said finally, testing the shape of his name on her lips. "Yes? Would you stay for supper tonight? Really stay, not just being polite, but because you want to." His smile widened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Hazel Winters, I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be." The old hand mirror had belonged to her mother, its silver backing spotted with age and its ornate handle tarnished by years of use. Hazel had avoided looking in it for months, but this morning, 3 weeks since Cyrus had first stayed for supper, she found herself drawn to its reflection like a moth to flame. What she saw there made her stomach clench with familiar self-loathing. Her face was rounder than it had been in her youth, softened by years and marked by the fine lines that came from squinting against mountain sun and wood smoke. Her body beneath the worn cotton nightgown was fuller than fashion dictated, curved in ways that clothing couldn't disguise. At 52, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had lived, who bore the evidence of her years and circumstances in every line and fold. "No wonder he hasn't tried to kiss me," she whispered to her reflection. "Look at you, Hazel, just look." The tears came without warning, hot and bitter, carrying 16 years of accumulated shame. She'd been fooling herself, letting hope take root where only realism belonged. Men like Cyrus might enjoy her company, might appreciate her cooking and her conversation. But when it came to real desire, real passion, they wanted women who looked like Margaret, young and slim and unmarked by time. She was still crying when she heard his knock, still clutching the mirror when she opened the door. Cyrus took one look at her tear-streaked face and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "What's happened?" His voice carried immediate concern, his hands reaching toward her before stopping, uncertain of their welcome. "Nothing's happened." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "I'm being foolish, that's all." "About what?" She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't bear to see the pity that would surely replace the warmth she'd grown accustomed to. "About thinking. about believing that someone like you could really want someone like me." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally dared to look at him, his expression held a kind of gentle exasperation that surprised her. "Hazel, what brought this on? Yesterday we were talking about you coming to see my cabin when the weather clears. Today you're acting like I'm some stranger who couldn't possibly care for you." "I looked in the mirror," she said simply, holding up the tarnished glass as if it were evidence in a trial. "And what did you see?" "The truth. A woman who's past her prime, who's never been beautiful, who's been fooling herself about what a man like you could feel for her." To her surprise, Cyrus didn't immediately contradict her or offer false reassurances. Instead, he reached for the mirror, studying his own reflection in its spotted surface. "I see a man with more grey than brown in his beard," he said quietly, "hands scarred by decades of hard work. Lines around my eyes that speak of too many winters and too much solitude." He looked up at her. "If we're cataloguing our flaws, I have plenty to choose from. That's different. Men age differently than women, do they? Or do we just tell ourselves that to make the passage of time easier to bear?" He set the mirror aside and moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hazel, may I touch you?" The question was so unexpected that she nodded before her doubts could interfere. His hands rose to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the traces of tears still clinging to her cheeks. "Do you want to know what I see when I look at you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, intimate and sure. "I see eyes the color of summer rain, deep enough to drown in. I see hands that create beauty from simple ingredients, that heal burns and ease loneliness with equal skill." His thumbs traced the curve of her cheekbones, and she felt herself trembling under his gentle touch. "I see a mouth that speaks kindness, even when the world has been cruel to you. A body that's lived and worked and endured, that tells the story of a woman strong enough to make her own way in hard country." His hands slid down to rest on her shoulders. "I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I can't understand why she refuses to see herself through my eyes. Because your eyes might be lying," she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "Are yours lying when you look at me? When you see past the scars and the grey hair to whatever it is that makes you smile when I arrive?" She considered this, recognizing the truth in his words. When she looked at Cyrus, she didn't see his age or his weathered appearance as flaws. They were simply part of the man who had become precious to her. "Evidence of a life fully lived. That's different," she protested weakly. "No, it isn't." His hands tightened on her shoulders, drawing her closer. "Hazel, I've been alone for 15 years. I chose that loneliness, cultivated it, made peace with it. But these past months with you have shown me the difference between being alone and being lonely. You've awakened parts of me I thought died with Margaret. I don't want to be your consolation prize, and I don't want to be yours." His smile was soft but determined. "What I want is to be the man who gets to see you first thing in the morning and last thing at night. The man who holds you when storms rage and laughs with you when the sun shines. The man who knows that every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive." Before she could voice another doubt, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, not tentatively or apologetically, but with the certainty of a man claiming what he treasured most. The kiss was gentle but firm, patient but purposeful, and it sent warmth flooding through every part of her body. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Hazel found herself staring into eyes that held no trace of doubt or settling or making do. Only desire, honest and undisguised. "Do you believe me now?" he asked softly. She wanted to. Oh, how she wanted to. But a lifetime of accumulated hurt wasn't easily dismissed, even by the most perfect kiss. "I'm trying to," she admitted. "Then try this." He picked up the mirror again, positioning it so they both appeared in its reflection, her face flushed and wondering, his gentle and sure. "Look at us together, Hazel. Tell me what you see." In the spotted glass, she saw two people who had found each other against all odds, who fit together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known was incomplete. She saw herself through his eyes for the first time, not as a woman diminished by age and circumstance, but as someone worthy of love, worthy of being chosen, worthy of happiness. "I see possibility," she whispered. "So do I," he replied, and kissed her again. The letter arrived on a bitter December morning, carried by a territorial messenger who looked half frozen from his journey through the mountain passes. Hazel signed for it with hands that shook from more than the cold. Official correspondence rarely brought good news to people like her. The heavy paper crackled as she unfolded it, revealing the territorial seal and formal language that made her heart sink before she'd read a single word. Legal terminology filled the page like a foreign language, but the meaning became clear as she forced herself to work through each devastating sentence. Notice of eminent domain. Railway development. 30 days to vacate or face legal action. Her cabin. The land her father had homesteaded and died working. The place where she'd buried her parents and built her life. All of it was being claimed for a railroad spur that would bring progress and prosperity. To the Wyoming Territory. She read the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated, and when they did, she sank into her mother's rocking chair with the paper clutched against her chest. 30 days. After 52 years in this place, she had 30 days to pack her life into wagons and disappear. When Cyrus arrived for his weekly visit, he found her still sitting in the chair, the letter in her lap and her face white with shock. "Hazel, what's wrong?" She handed him the document without speaking, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as he read. When he finished, he set the letter aside and knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. "This can't be legal," he said firmly. "You've got a clear deed to this land. Read the fine print." Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "Apparently, the territorial government has the right to claim any property deemed necessary for infrastructure development. They're offering compensation, but money can't replace a home." She nodded, feeling tears threaten again. "I don't know where I'll go, Cyrus. This is all I've ever known. My parents are buried here. My life is here. Without this place, I'm nothing." "That's not true." His voice carried a fierce certainty that cut through her despair. "You're not nothing, Hazel. You're everything that matters. With or without this cabin, you don't understand." She pulled her hands free and stood abruptly, facing to the window that looked out over the land she was about to lose. "This bakery, this life I've built, it's the only thing that makes me valuable. Take that away and what am I? Just another aging spinster with nowhere to go and nothing to offer." "Stop that." Cyrus rose and followed her, his voice gentle but firm. "Stop reducing yourself to what you can produce for other people. It's the truth, though, isn't it?" She turned to face him, and he saw the old insecurities flooding back, threatening to wash away months of growing confidence. "Without this place, without my baking, what reason would you have to keep visiting me?" The question hung between them like a blade, sharp with the potential to cut through everything they'd built together. Cyrus stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, not hurt exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. "Is that really what you think of me?" he asked quietly. "That I've been coming here all these months for the bread?" "Not just the bread." She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she had in years. "But be honest, Cyrus. If I were just some woman you met in town, without anything to offer, would you have looked twice at me?" "I don't know," he admitted, and she felt her heart crack at the honesty. "But not because of your appearance, or your age, or any of the things you think disqualify you from being loved. Because I wouldn't have gotten to know you. I wouldn't have seen your strength, your kindness, your quiet courage." He moved closer, his voice growing more urgent. "Hazel, I fell in love with the woman who opens her door to strangers in storms. With the person who puts care into every loaf of bread, not because she has to, but because it's in her nature to nurture. With someone strong enough to live alone on this mountain, and gentle enough to heal a wounded heart." "Pretty words," she said bitterly. "But when push comes to shove, when I'm homeless and penniless, will they still be true?" Something flashed across his features, frustration perhaps, or pain at her lack of trust. There's something I haven't told you about myself, Hazel. Something I should have mentioned before now. What? He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. I'm not just a trapper, not just some hermit who lives off the land. Before Margaret died, before I came to the mountains, I was a territorial judge. I served in that capacity for 12 years. Hazel stared at him, trying to reconcile this information with everything she thought she knew about him. A judge? I have property, Hazel. Investments. More money than I know what to do with, sitting in banks back east. I could buy this land 10 times over if that's what it took to keep you here. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. You've been lying to me. I haven't lied. You let me believe you were like me. Poor, simple, making do with what little you had. Her voice rose with each word, fueled by hurt and humiliation. When all this time you were slumming it, playing at being a mountain man while your real life waited somewhere else. That's not, isn't it? She backed away from him, seeing everything between them through a new lens. My God, I've been such a fool. Of course you could afford to be charmed by the quaint mountain baker. Of course you could overlook my flaws when this was all just a temporary diversion. Hazel, please listen to me. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out as a whisper, more wounded than angry now. If you cared about me, if any of this was real, why keep such a secret? Cyrus's shoulders sagged as if under a great weight. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. I knew you'd assume I was offering charity instead of love. Weren't you? No. The word came out flat and final. I came to these mountains to heal from losing everything that mattered to me. I stayed because I found someone worth living for again. My past, my money, my former position, none of that changes what I feel for you. But it changes everything else, doesn't it? She gestured around the cabin that suddenly felt like a dollhouse compared to his real world. This struggle that's defined my entire life, it's nothing to you. You could solve all my problems with the stroke of a pen. Would that be so terrible? Yes! The word exploded from her with surprising force. Because then, I'd never know if you wanted me or if you just felt sorry for me. I'd spend every day wondering if I was your beloved or your charity case. They stood facing each other across the small cabin, the letter lying between them, like evidence of how quickly life could shatter carefully built dreams. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and reminding them both that winter was closing in, whether they were ready or not. So what happens now? Cyrus asked finally. Hazel looked around her cabin, at the kitchen where she'd learned to bake, at the rocking chair where her mother had told her stories, at the small table where she and Cyrus had shared so many meals and conversations. In 30 days, it would all belong to someone else, transformed into something unrecognizable in the name of progress. Now I figure out how to start over, she said quietly. Alone, like I should have expected all along. It doesn't have to be alone. She met his eyes, seeing the pain there, the genuine desire to help. But she also saw the gulf between them that his revelation had created, not just in circumstances, but in the fundamental question of whether their love was built on truth or illusion. Maybe it does, she said. Maybe that's the only way I'll know who I really am. The stack of legal documents on Hazel's kitchen table grew thicker each day as Cyrus brought papers, deeds, and correspondence that painted an increasingly clear picture of the conspiracy threatening her home. What had initially seemed like a straightforward government land claim revealed itself as something far more complex and personal. Look at this, Cyrus said, spreading out a surveyor's map marked with red lines and notations. His transformation from gentle suitor to determined advocate had been swift and complete, though the careful distance he now maintained between them spoke of wounds still fresh from their confrontation. The proposed railway spur doesn't actually need your land. There are 3 alternate routes that would serve just as well. Hazel studied the map, her finger tracing the various colored lines. Then why are they insisting on mine? Because someone specifically requested this route. Someone with enough influence to override the more practical options. He pulled out another document, this one bearing several official signatures. It took some digging, but I found the name behind the land grab." She looked at the paper he indicated, her blood chilling as she recognized the signature at the bottom. "Harold Pembroke. Your former fiancé is now the Territorial Land Commissioner. He's also, according to these records, the majority shareholder in the company that will build this railway spur." Cyrus's voice remained professionally neutral, but she could see the anger simmering beneath his controlled demeanor. "He's using his position to force you off your land so his company can acquire it at government compensation rates, a fraction of its actual value." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Harold, the man who had rejected her 16 years ago because she wasn't worthy of his public affection, was now using his power to destroy the life she'd built in the aftermath of his abandonment. "He wants to punish me," she whispered, sinking into her chair. "After all these years, he still wants to punish me for existing. Maybe. Or maybe he just wants the land and doesn't care who he hurts to get it." Cyrus gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Either way, we're going to fight him. We—" She looked up at him, noting his careful use of the plural. "I thought I made it clear that I need to handle this alone. You made it clear that you don't trust my motives for helping you. But Hazel, this isn't about us anymore. It's about justice. Harold Pembroke is abusing his office for personal gain, and that's something I can't let stand, regardless of our personal situation." His words stung because they were true. She'd pushed him away, questioned everything beautiful that had grown between them, and now he was offering help not as a lover, but as a man of principles. The distance in his manner, the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes for too long, reminded her daily of what her lack of trust had cost them both. "What kind of fight are you talking about?" she asked, trying to focus on practicalities rather than the ache in her chest. "Legal challenge. I still have contacts in the territorial government, judges who knew me when I served on the bench, men who understand that land commissioners shouldn't profit personally from their official decisions." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, close enough to work, but far enough to maintain the careful boundaries she'd insisted upon. "It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but we can expose what he's doing and what happens to me in the meantime. I still have to be out in 23 days. Actually, no. Filing a legal challenge automatically extends your residency until the case is resolved. You can stay here while we fight." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by suspicion. "How convenient that you happen to know exactly how to navigate the legal system." Cyrus's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, Hazel. How convenient that my education and experience might actually help you instead of making you feel inadequate." The sharp edge in his voice made her flinch. She'd spent so many days questioning his motives, dissecting his past revelation for evidence of deception, that she'd forgotten how her doubts must sound to a man who'd offered her nothing but honesty and devotion. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know you're trying to help. I'm not trying to do anything except protect someone I care about from being cheated out of her home." He softened slightly, but the careful distance remained. "Whether you believe that or not is up to you." Over the following days, they worked together with the focused efficiency of business partners rather than the easy intimacy they'd once shared. Cyrus brought more documents, more evidence of Harold's corruption, while Hazel provided details about her family's history with the land, the improvements they'd made, the legal basis for their claim. The wooden robin still sat on her kitchen table, but now it seemed to mock her with its promise of spring and renewal. She'd thrown away something precious because she couldn't believe herself worthy of it, and now she was left with the cold comfort of being right about her own inadequacy. "There's something else you should know," Cyrus said one afternoon as they reviewed testimony from other landowners who'd been pressured to sell. "Harold's been telling people that you're mentally incompetent, that living alone on the mountain has affected your judgment. He's claiming the government seizure is really a mercy, protecting you from your own poor decisions." Hazel's hands stilled on the paper she was organizing. "He's saying I'm insane? He's saying you're not capable of managing your own affairs. It's a common tactic when someone wants to discredit a property owner's legal standing. And what if he's right?" The words came out barely above a whisper. What if I'm just a crazy old woman who's been living in a fantasy? Cyrus looked up from his work, and for a moment the careful professional mask slipped, showing her a glimpse of the man who'd held her hands and called her beautiful. Hazel, the only thing that's crazy is how willing you are to believe the worst about yourself. Look at the evidence. Cyrus, I'm 52 years old, never been married, living alone on a mountain, talking to sourdough starter like it's a person. Harold could make a convincing case that I'm not competent to make major decisions. Harold could also make a convincing case that the sun revolves around the earth if it served his purposes. Cyrus's voice grew firmer. You're one of the most capable, intelligent women I've ever known. The fact that you've managed this property alone for 3 years, built a successful business, maintained relationships with customers throughout the territory, that's evidence of competence, not insanity. But what if I lose? What if the judge believes Harold instead of us? What if I really am just... Stop! Cyrus reached across the table and covered her hands with his, the first time he'd touched her since their argument. Stop letting that man live in your head rent-free. Harold Pembroke rejected you 16 years ago, and you've been carrying his voice around ever since, letting it tell you who you are and what you're worth. His hands were warm and steady, just as she remembered, and she felt tears threatening. I'm scared, Cyrus, not just of losing the cabin, but of discovering that everything I've believed about myself is true. What if it's not, though? What if you're actually remarkable and strong and worthy of love, and you've just been too afraid to believe it? She looked into his eyes and saw not the careful distance of recent days, but something deeper, not pity or obligation, but genuine faith in her worth. It was terrifying and wonderful and more than she felt capable of accepting. I don't know how to be that person, she admitted. You don't have to know how. You just have to be willing to try. His thumbs brushed across her knuckles. And Hazel, you don't have to try alone. Whatever happens with us personally, whatever you decide about trusting me or accepting my help, I'm not going anywhere until this fight is finished. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, carrying the promise of the worst storm of the winter. But inside, surrounded by legal papers and evidence of corruption, Hazel felt something shifting in her chest, not the warm certainty of love, which seemed too fragile to trust, but something harder and more durable. The determination to fight not just for her land, but for the right to define herself on her own terms, instead of through the eyes of men who had never bothered to truly see her. All right, she said quietly. Tell me what we need to do. His smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him in days. We're going to show them exactly what Hazel Winters is capable of. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was nothing like the rough-hewn buildings Hazel was accustomed to in the mountains. Its imposing stone facade and tall windows spoke of official power and formal justice, making her feel small and out of place. In her best dress, a simple brown wool that had seemed respectable at home but felt shabby. Among the polished brass and mahogany of the courtroom, Harold Pembroke sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who exuded the kind of confidence that came from winning cases through technicalities rather than truth. Harold himself looked prosperous and distinguished at 48, his hair silver at the temples in a way that suggested wisdom rather than age. When he glanced at Hazel, his expression held the same mixture of pity and distaste she remembered from their wedding day 16 years ago. All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison, the bailiff announced, and Hazel stood on shaking legs as a stern-faced man in black robes took the bench. Judge Morrison was one of Cyrus's former colleagues, a fact that offered some comfort but no guarantee of favorable treatment. The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, officially beginning the hearing that would determine whether Hazel kept her home or lost everything she'd ever known. Harold's attorney spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced as he outlined the government's case for eminent domain. He painted a picture of progress and prosperity, of a railroad spur that would bring commerce and civilization to the remote Wyoming territory. His words made the seizure sound like a noble sacrifice for the greater good. Furthermore, Your Honor, the attorney continued, there are concerns about Miss Winters' competency to make rational decisions regarding this matter. Living in isolation for extended periods has, according to several witnesses, affected her judgment and emotional stability. Hazel felt heat rise in her cheeks as the attorney presented testimony from townspeople who described her as reclusive, eccentric, prone to talking to herself during her baking. The statements weren't entirely false. She did speak aloud while she worked, often addressing her mother's memory or muttering through complex recipes. But hearing her private habits dissected in a courtroom, presented as evidence of mental instability, made her feel exposed and vulnerable. When Cyrus rose to cross-examine the witnesses, his transformation from gentle mountain man to skilled attorney was complete. His questions were sharp and precise, designed to reveal the bias and ulterior motives behind each testimony. Mr. Patterson, he addressed one of Harold's witnesses, you testified that Miss Winters appeared disturbed and antisocial during your interactions with her. How many times have you actually spoken with my client? The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, I've seen her in town. How many conversations, Mr. Patterson? Perhaps once or twice, and during these 1 or 2 conversations spanning, 5 minutes total, you formed a professional opinion about her mental state. I'm just saying what I observed, what you observed from a distance, based on hearsay from others, and filtered through your own assumptions about how a woman should behave. Cyrus's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. Is that accurate? One by one, he dismantled the character witnesses, revealing them to be men who barely knew Hazel but felt qualified to judge her competency based on gossip and prejudice. Several admitted they'd never had meaningful conversations with her, had never visited her property, had never witnessed any actual evidence of mental instability. But it was when Harold himself took the stand that the real battle began. Mr. Pembroke, Cyrus said, approaching the witness box with the careful grace of a predator. You've known my client for many years, haven't you? Yes, we were. Acquainted in our younger days. Acquainted. Is that how you describe a 6-month engagement? Harold's composure flickered slightly. That was a long time ago. Circumstances change. Indeed they do. You've done quite well for yourself since then. Territorial Land Commissioner, majority shareholder in Rocky Mountain Railway Development. Quite a rise in fortune and position. I've worked hard for everything I've achieved, including this particular railway route that happens to run directly through Miss Winters' property. Harold's attorney objected, but Judge Morrison allowed the question. Harold straightened in his chair, his voice growing defensive. The route was chosen based on engineering surveys and practical considerations. Practical considerations. Cyrus moved to the evidence table and picked up the surveyor's maps they'd compiled. Like the fact that 3 alternate routes would cost less to build, require fewer property acquisitions, and cause less environmental disruption. I wouldn't know about that. I'm not an engineer. No, but you are the land commissioner who approved this specific route. The route that happens to target the property of a woman you publicly humiliated 16 years ago. The courtroom fell silent. Hazel watched Harold's face flush with anger, saw the mask of professional dignity slip to reveal the petty cruelty beneath. Your Honor, Harold's attorney interjected, Mr. Blackwood's personal attacks are irrelevant to the question of eminent domain. On the contrary, Cyrus replied smoothly, they go directly to the question of whether this land seizure serves the public good or personal vendetta. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his gavel poised. Mr. Pembroke, you will answer the question. Is there any personal animosity between you and Miss Winters that might have influenced your decision regarding this route? Harold's jaw worked silently for a long moment, and Hazel saw 16 years of accumulated resentment and wounded pride warring with his need to maintain professional credibility. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of barely controlled fury. Miss Winters has always been difficult to work with, stubborn, unreasonable, Perhaps that influenced my assessment of her ability to contribute positively to territorial development. The admission hung in the air like smoke, revealing the ugly truth beneath the legal pretenses. Judge Morrison's gavel struck the bench with finality. The court finds clear evidence of personal bias and abuse of office in this matter. The eminent domain claim is hereby dismissed, and Miss Winters retains full rights to her property. Relief flooded through Hazel like warm honey. But it was quickly followed by something more profound, a deep recognition that she had fought for herself and won, not through Cyrus's money or connections, but through her own courage to stand up and demand justice. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, Harold Pembroke approached their table. His face was pale with defeat, but his eyes still held the same cold disdain that had wounded her so many years ago. "You think you've won something," he said quietly. His voice meant only for her ears. "But look at yourself, Hazel. Look at what you are. Do you really think any of this changes the fundamental truth about you?" Before Cyrus could intervene, before her old habits of self-doubt could reassert themselves, Hazel stood and faced the man who had shaped her self-perception for 16 bitter years. "You want to know what I see when I look at myself, Harold?" Her voice was steady, carrying a strength that surprised even her. "I see a woman who built a life from nothing after you walked away, who survived winters that would have broken softer people, who turned her mother's recipes into a business that feeds half the territory." Harold's mouth tightened. "But she wasn't finished. I see someone who was brave enough to love again after you taught her she wasn't worthy of it. Someone who stood up to a corrupt official, even when that official was you, and won." She stepped closer, no longer intimidated by his height or his authority. "What I don't see anymore is a woman who needs your approval to know her own worth." For a moment, Harold's composure cracked completely, revealing the insecure man beneath the polished facade. Then he turned and walked away without another word, leaving Hazel standing victorious in more ways than one. Outside the courthouse, the winter air was sharp and clean, carrying the promise of snow. Cyrus fell into step beside her as they walked toward the hotel where they would spend the night before beginning the long journey home. "That was magnificent," he said quietly. "The way you stood up to him, I've never seen anything braver. I had a good teacher." She glanced at him sideways, noting the careful distance he still maintained between them. "Cyrus, about what I said before, about not trusting your motives, you don't need to apologize for protecting yourself." "Yes, I do." She stopped walking, forcing him to face her on the courthouse steps. "I was so afraid of being hurt again that I threw away something precious. I questioned your feelings, not because they seemed false, but because they seemed too good to be true." The wind caught her hair, pulling strands loose from the careful bun she'd arranged that morning. Cyrus reached up automatically to brush them from her face, then caught himself and let his hand fall. "Hazel, you need to understand something. My feelings for you were never dependent on your gratitude or your circumstances. But they do depend on your trust." "I know." She took a deep breath, feeling more vulnerable than she had even in the courtroom. "And I want you to know that I'm ready now. Ready to trust what you've been trying to tell me. Ready to see myself the way you see me. How do I see you?" The question was gentle, but she heard the deeper challenge in it. He wanted her to say it, to claim her own worth in her own words. "You see a woman who's strong enough to stand alone, but brave enough to choose partnership. Someone who's lived fully, loved deeply, survived heartbreak, and found the courage to try again." Her voice grew steadier with each word. "You see someone worthy of love, not despite her flaws, but including them." Something shifted in his expression, the careful professional distance finally melting away to reveal the warmth she'd missed so desperately. "There's one more thing I see," he said softly, moving closer. "I see the woman I want to spend the rest of my life loving, if she'll have me." Before she could lose her nerve, before the old doubts could resurface, Hazel stepped into his arms and kissed him with all the passion and certainty she'd been too afraid to show before. The kiss was everything there first had been and more, a promise, a commitment, a declaration that she was finally ready to accept the love she'd always believed herself unworthy of receiving. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Cyrus rested his forehead against hers. "Does this mean you'll marry me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you asking? Hazel Winters, will you be my wife? Will you let me love you for the rest of our days, through good times and hard times, through winters and springs, through everything life brings us?" She thought of her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in the trunk at the foot of her bed. She thought of the cabin that was truly hers now, the life she'd built with her own hands, the strength she'd discovered in herself. "Yes," she whispered, and kissed him again. Tasting joy and possibility, and the sweet promise of a future she finally believed herself worthy of claiming. 6 months later, spring came to the Wyoming mountains with unusual gentleness, as if the harsh winter had spent all its fury and left only warmth and renewal in its wake. Hazel stood in her kitchen, now their kitchen, watching Cyrus install the new bread oven he'd designed and built with his own hands. The oven was a marvel of engineering and artistry, twice the size of her old wood stove, but crafted to blend seamlessly with the cabin's rustic character. Its brickwork bore intricate patterns that reminded her of the wooden robin, still perched on their kitchen table. Now joined by other small carvings Cyrus created during quiet evenings, a deer, a pine tree, a pair of hands joined in marriage. "Test batch?" Cyrus asked, standing back to admire his work. His face was smudged with mortar and sweat, his hair falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his 57 years. "Always," Hazel replied, already reaching for her mixing bowls. The familiar rhythm of measuring and mixing felt different now, not the solitary meditation it had been for so many years, but a shared joy enhanced by Cyrus's presence and his genuine appreciation for her craft. As she worked, she caught sight of her reflection in the window and paused, struck by how much she'd changed since that bitter December morning when Harold's letter had threatened to destroy everything. The woman looking back at her stood straighter, smiled more easily, moved with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. Her hair was still grey, her body still soft and rounded, her face still marked by time and weather, but none of that mattered anymore because she finally saw herself through eyes that recognized beauty in strength, grace in resilience, worth in the simple act of living fully. The new oven heated perfectly, filling their expanded kitchen with warmth that seemed to reach every corner of the cabin. Cyrus had made other improvements too. A larger table for their growing business, additional shelving for supplies, and a comfortable chair by the window where he could work on his carvings while she baked. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. "Your oven is ready for its inaugural loaves, Mrs. Blackwood." Even after 3 months of marriage, the name still sent a thrill through her. They'd wed in early March, with Judge Morrison performing the ceremony and half the territory in attendance, not because they were socially prominent, but because everyone wanted to witness the triumph of the mountain baker who had stood up to corruption and found love in the process. Hazel had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her fuller figure and updated with lace that had belonged to Cyrus's grandmother. Standing in the small church in Cheyenne, surrounded by miners and trappers and townspeople who had come to respect her strength, she'd felt beautiful for the first time in her life, not because her appearance had changed, but because she'd finally learned to see herself as worthy of the love shining in her husband's eyes. "The Hendricks girl is coming by this afternoon for her first baking lesson," Hazel mentioned as she shaped the dough with practiced hands. "Poor thing is convinced she'll never learn to make decent bread. Reminds me of someone else I know," Cyrus said with a gentle smile. Someone who was convinced she'd never learn to see her own worth. Martha Hendricks was 19 and newly married, struggling with the same insecurities about domestic skills that had once plagued women throughout the territory. When she'd approached Hazel shyly at the general store, asking for baking lessons, Hazel had seen her younger self in the girl's worried expression. "Different lesson, same principle," Hazel agreed. "Sometimes we all need someone to show us what we're capable of." The morning passed peacefully as the first loaves emerged from the new oven, their crusts golden and perfect, their aroma filling the cabin with the scent of home and contentment. Word of the new oven had already spread throughout the territory, bringing new customers and old ones eager to sample the improved results. When Martha arrived that afternoon, nervous and apologetic, Hazel welcomed her with the same patience her own mother had shown years ago. She guided the young woman through the process of mixing and kneading, explaining not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. How baking was an act of love. How patience and practice mattered more than perfection. How the greatest ingredient was the care you put into your work. "I don't know if I'll ever be as good as you, Mrs. Blackwood," Martha said, watching her first attempt at dinner rolls rise in the warm kitchen. "You don't need to be as good as me," Hazel replied, remembering similar words her mother had spoken decades ago. "You just need to be good at being yourself. The rest will come with time." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Hazel and Cyrus sat on their front porch, sharing the day's last cup of coffee. The robin he'd carved still held its place of honor on their kitchen table, but now it was joined by the reality it had promised, the return of warmth, of hope, of the belief that good things could grow, even from the hardest ground. "Any regrets?" Cyrus asked, his arm around her shoulders, as they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. Hazel considered the question seriously, thinking of all the years of loneliness, all the doubts and fears that had nearly cost them their chance at happiness. "Only one," she said finally. "I regret how long it took me to understand what my mother tried to teach me." "What was that?" She leaned into his warmth, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "That love isn't something you have to earn. It's something you choose to accept when it's offered freely." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and inside their cabin, tomorrow's bread rose slowly in the gentle heat of the oven, built by loving hands. In the morning, there would be customers to serve, lessons to teach, and the thousand small joys that came with a life fully lived and freely chosen. But tonight, there was only this: the warmth of shared love, the satisfaction of work well done, and the quiet certainty that some things, like good bread, like deep roots, like hearts that recognize their match, are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth treasuring once they're finally found.